Hello, and welcome to session 2 of HONS400. I'm glad to pick up the argument with you today. So today my goal is to provide some framework for understanding the discussion of John Stuart Mill, but also the discussion of John Rawls, which we'll turn to in a week or so. And I'd like to start by discussing briefly the idea of political philosophy. What is political philosophy? It turns out that political philosophy is tremendously important for the subject which we are most concerned about here, and that has to do with the value and the viability of liberal democracy. So what is political philosophy? And my very brief description would be to say that it is a field in which we debate and discuss the principles and the theories and the values which come to mind about the nature and the moral requirements of collective life together within society. Political philosophy is concerned with justice, with the nature of the good state, and with the obligations that we as citizens have to the whole, but also the limits and constraints which the whole society has with regard to its behavior towards the individual citizen. There's an interesting distinction which runs through much political philosophy, the distinction between the idea of the public realm, where we function as citizens, and the private realm, where we function as private, self-interested individuals. And I would like to emphasize that political philosophy is and has always been a very practical subject. It asks a general question: how should groups of individuals govern themselves? How should we live together justly and peacefully? And then finally, what constitutes a just and legitimate state? So one question which political philosophers have needed to confront is the question of what is the relationship between the individual and political society, individual and community. What is the value of political society, or what the Greeks referred to as the polis? And you may be taken back to your discussion several years ago in the Four Trials course of Socrates and his life in Athens, the city-state of Athens. And one observation is that political society is more than just a location where we do our private activities. It is a morally constituted community, or at least this is one set of values that we can have about political society, that it is a place where equal citizens can flourish, a place that has moral importance over and above the individual wants and desires and liberties which we pursue in everyday life. And a political society is a place which should be regulated by principles of justice. It should be a place where the basic institutions treat everyone fairly and legitimately. And furthermore, a just society is one in which the moral emotions of loyalty, patriotism, civic commitment, these ideas make sense in the context of the polis or of political society. And this turns out to be both a theme of political philosophy over a period of 2,000 years, but also a fundamental question. Traditional liberals hold that the collectivity has no moral standing, or at best a derivative moral standing, and that only the freedoms, rights, and liberties of individuals are fundamentally morally significant. I'd like to read a couple passages from a political philosopher, Melissa Lane, from her entry in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy on ancient political philosophy. But she has several paragraphs which I think are very relevant to political philosophy more generally. So she writes, "Justice was conceived by poets, lawgivers, and philosophers alike as the structure of civic bonds which were beneficial to all, rich and poor, powerful and weak alike, rather than an exploitation of some by others." She goes on, "So, understood, Justice defined the basis of equal citizenship and was said to be the requirement for human regimes to be acceptable to the gods. The ideal was that with justice as a foundation, political life would enable its participants to flourish and to achieve the overarching human end of happiness, expressing a civic form of virtue and pursuing happiness and success through the competitive forums of the city. She also writes another, I think, insightful paragraph about political philosophy. Among equals, however defined, the space of the political was the space of participation in decision-making concerning public affairs and actions. That invention of the political was the hallmark of the classical Greek world. Citizens, whether the few, usually the rich, or the many, including the poor and perhaps the poorest, gathered together to conduct public affairs, sharing either by custom, by election, or by lot, in holding or holding accountable the offices for carrying them out. In other words, two really fundamental topics of political philosophy emerged from political thinking in the 4th century BCE, the idea of equality among citizens and the idea of self-determination by the citizens, or in other words, the fundamental value of democracy. There's another idea which is very important within political philosophy, and this is the idea of the common good or of the general will. The idea that over and above the individual opinions that we have, there is something that we might refer to as the good of society as a whole, or the common good. And Jean-Jacques Rousseau in the 18th century summarized this idea in terms of two distinct ideas. He referred to the common will, which is kind of the majority opinion of a population, and he distinguishes that from the general will, which he thinks is the true and abiding interests of the society as a whole, meaning all the individuals in the society. Josh Cohen is a political philosopher at Stanford who wrote a very interesting book about Rousseau, and this passage I think is also worth quoting. The essential point about content is that Rousseau's solution requires that individuals commit to regarding themselves as belonging to a political community whose members are committed to regarding one another as equals, acknowledging one another as political equals, with equal status in establishing the laws, recognizing one another as equally subject to the laws, and agreeing to regulate their association by reference to reasons of the common good, which gives equal weight to the good of each citizen. So the ideas of self-determination and full and complete equality among all citizens, these are fundamental ideas of democracy, and as Josh Cohen is saying here, they're fundamental to Rousseau's conception of a good society and a democratic society. Today we're reading and discussing John Stuart Mill, who is a classical liberal, and there is a philosophical disagreement between classical liberalism and the, let's call it, richer social philosophy, political philosophy of Rousseau and other social contract thinkers. But classical liberal philosophers like John Stuart Mill, Adam Smith, John Locke put the primary moral emphasis on the individual rather than on society. Society and government are thought to be instrumental in furthering the good of individuals rather than being morally valuable in themselves. John Stuart Mill is, in this sense, a classical liberal when he writes about the limits of the state and society On Liberty with respect to the liberties of the individual. Now, this is in some ways a matter of nuance, because classical liberals also recognize that there is great value in social collaboration and in convening with other people to achieve common purposes and common goods. But the big question is whether there is real value in the community as a whole, over and above the value of the fulfillment of the purposes of the individuals who make it up. Classical liberalism emphasizes these moral ideas, ideas of individual rights, individual liberties, and equality of all persons and all citizens. The key political value is the cultivation and preservation of the rights and liberties of individuals. Liberal democracy always depends on the moral and political equality of its citizens, even though we all recognize that equality throughout centuries is impaired at various times because of various invidious distinctions which arise in society. The US Constitution embodies this idea of the equality of citizens, though, of course, not as a result of reading Mill. The US Constitution was written before Mill. But also the other reading that you have done for today, the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, embodies a commitment to these liberal values of equality, liberty, and individual rights, and recognizes as well a broader conception of positive rights and a broader conception of the value of social cooperation. So when Mill turns to government more explicitly in a book that you have not read, a book that he wrote in the 1850s called Considerations on Representative Government, he is pretty explicit in saying that government is purely instrumental in the sense that it exists in order to increase the well-being of the citizens which comprise it. Government itself has no intrinsic value. It is only valuable insofar as it brings about and maintains the good of its citizens as individuals. This book, by the way, Considerations on Representative Government, is a very interesting book to read, and it's very interesting to compare what Mill has to say about the state and democracy in that book with what Rousseau has to say in his social contract theory of the state and justice. In the book that you read for today's session on the liberty of the individual, Mill makes a very strong statement about the relationship between the state and individual liberty. And his view is that there is a strict limit created by morality, a strict limit created by our proper understanding of the dignity of the individual human being. And that limit is that the state cannot limit liberty, cannot limit freedom for any reason except the purpose of preventing harm to other citizens. The only purpose, the only reason for limiting freedoms, limiting liberty, is to prevent harms by one individual or group of individuals against other individuals. So basically, committing harm through violence or action similar to violence, those kinds of behavior can be prohibited and limited by the state. But other kinds of behavior, which are perhaps distasteful or other people don't like, it is Mill's view that the state has no authority whatsoever to create legal limitations on behavior which does not harm other people. So our question, as I said last week in introduction of the course, our question is this: is liberal democracy in the 21st century stable? And I believe that at this time in our history, not only in the United States, but in Europe and Asia and Latin America, this is a hugely important question. Does a society embodying liberal values of individual liberties and democratic decision-making create the sociological conditions which are needed to lead to a self-reinforcing stability over time? Are democratic institutions, using a word that I introduced last time, are democratic institutions resilient? Or, on the other hand, is a liberal democracy vulnerable to being undermined by anti-liberal groups and ideas, groups like neo-Nazis and Ku Klux Klan adherents and white supremacists and so forth? And this question is not a question within political philosophy exclusively. Instead, it is an empirical and sociological question. But history also is relevant to this question because history shows us that democracies die. If we are to have a stable democracy, then we need to have positive answers to questions like these. Do the basic arrangements of a democratic society satisfy citizens that they are fair? Are citizens satisfied that they are being treated fairly? Do citizens believe that they are being treated equally? Or are they being exploited? Are other people being treated more favorably? Do the basic arrangements of the democracy create ample and reasonably equal opportunities for everyone? That is, does every individual, does every family have a reasonable chance to improve their conditions of life over time through the opportunities made available to them? And then finally, I think it's pretty clear in the contemporary time period, we have to ask the question, are there ideological issues that undermine the stability of a democracy? Perhaps religious differences, perhaps disagreements about ethnicity and race, or disagreements about the basic institutions of the economy. Are there irresolvable conflicts which can arise between groups which lead fundamentally to instability, lead to conflict, and lead eventually to the decline of democracy? Those are the questions in front of us, and today's discussion of Mill and his central liberal commitments to liberty and a limited state, a frankly very narrowly limited state, that's the subject of today's conversation.